Hi, everyone. You're listening to Let's Psyconnect. This is LT.
And this is Ronnie.
We're also inviting you to watch this conversation that we're having today because we actually had guest speakers and that you can watch the video on our YouTube or IGTV. So go to our Instagram page, Let's Psyconnect, all one word, lowercase. And today we're going to do another episode on our suicide prevention series. We want to be research informed. And so we're going to be sharing some information that these guest speakers are bringing and sharing with us, and basically telling us what research and guidelines pertaining to suicide prevention and intervention say. So Ronnie, please introduce our guest speakers.
Of course, thank you, LT. And I'll start by saying I think a lot of what we talk about and include in our podcast is very infused with research. So what better way to infuse some more research to go directly to the source? So we're so happy to have Kayla and Sam here today. I'm going to read just a brief bio of each of them, and then we will have them take it away. Okay. So Kayla Wagler is a project manager for Project Safeguard, a research project studying the effectiveness of lethal means safety counseling among National Guard members. She is a member of the Suicide and Emotion Dysregulation Lab, collaborating with both University of Southern Mississippi and Rutgers University. She earned her bachelor's in psychology and Spanish from and Spanish from Florida State University, and plans to pursue a PhD in clinical psychology focusing on suicide risk and prevention research. She is particularly interested in assessing suicide risk and prevention strategies within marginalized populations, specifically in the LGBTQ plus community. Kayla is passionate about suicide prevention and education and has served as a National Suicide Prevention Lifeline volunteer counselor. Welcome, Kayla. How are you? And of course, Sam Darawala is a fourth-year clinical psychology doctoral student in the Suicide and Emotion Dysregulation Lab as well at the University of Southern Mississippi. Her research interests focus on military suicide prevention and the role of firearms in suicide. She is also interested in further understanding how masculinity is associated with suicide and willingness to seek help for suicidal thoughts and behaviors. She is leading the MS Gun Storage Map Project, an effort to create a map that will list Mississippi gun shops are willing to store personal firearms during a suicidal crisis. So welcome, Kayla and Sam. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Yeah.
We're very excited to have you both here. As Ronnie said, we really try to get information from research and share with the public, in special other mental health professionals, so that we continue to enhance our critical thinking and professional skills. So without further ado, let's start talking about suicide prevention here. What are some of the myths, I guess, associated with suicide? Because we hear suicide, and then people think of maybe just somebody was just like depressed. And so what are some myths associated with that?
Yeah, sure. So one of the myths, like you just mentioned, about depression is that people who die by suicide aren't always depressed. They don't always meet the criteria for depression. And likewise, those who have depression don't always experience suicidal thoughts and behaviors. So there are a lot of other factors, not just depression, that could lead to suicidal thoughts and behaviors, such as financial stress or substance use, or a whole host of other experiences that folks can have. And not everyone who experiences suicidal ideation or any kind of attempts have a diagnosable illness. So that's what you just mentioned. Yeah.
No, that is very informative for sure. And I think it helps put suicide prevention in a different context too, because as professionals, we're not just like looking at whether or not somebody meets criteria for depression or PTD, right? So persistent, just to see if like they talk about suicide in that context. So it's important to always be aware of other factors that can be associated with suicide ideation in attempt. And with that, do suicide thoughts always lead to attempt?
No, that is another myth. Suicidal thoughts don't always lead to attempt. It's actually very low base rate for those who do have suicidal thoughts and then lead to attempts. It's obviously still extremely important to catch those. But there are different types of suicidal thoughts, and also that can differ in severity and intent. By severity, we mean if the person has access to lethal means, if they've attempted before, if they've had prior experiences. And we also call it a short-term crisis. We call it a crisis point. So suicide is often a short-term crisis, and that makes reducing access to lethal means that much more important.
Yeah, yeah. I'll hop in and say I think that that's such a great point and an important point because I think sometimes, and I don't want to speak, you know, in general terms, but I think sometimes the media or what we kind of hear about what happens leading up to suicide or what happens around suicidal thoughts, a lot of that can be misleading, right? And as you mentioned, those signs aren't always overt, right? A lot of
Absolutely.
times they're covert. A lot of times. We would think that functioning could be normal, or even there's a period of maybe low functioning, and then they increase their functioning, and they're more energetic, seems to be more stable. But that doesn't necessarily mean that those either suicidal ideations or the suicidal plan isn't there. So I think that is important to understand as well.
Right.
Yeah. And you're talking about two things here that I also want to address. One was prevention. So if you prevent someone from dying by suicide, does it mean that they would just find another way?
So research has actually shown that reducing access to like one method doesn't generally lead someone to choose another method to attempt with. Um, and in the rare instances and when they do find another method or like substitute it, if it's in the case of like a firearm, that substituted method is most likely going to be less lethal than that initial method of a firearm, which really gets into the importance of firearm means safety and
Mhm.
suicide prevention.
So since you actually brought me to my other question here, so owning a firearm or having access to a firearm, does it lead to suicidal behavior?
No. So research has shown that ownership does not cause someone to become suicidal or have those thoughts. Rather, if someone's experiencing those thoughts, the risk of suicide can increase because now they have access to a lethal means. So they might have an idea of now how to enact their thoughts.
Okay. So I guess since we're talking about firearms here, then let's go over a couple of points here pertaining to firearms. So we think about firearms, and do we? I guess so. Let's take a step back here. When you're in school and receiving training, are we getting the training to help us think of firearms as a way to one, die by suicide, and then two, are we getting training to ask the question if you own a firearm, right, or if you have weapons? I think that's more. I guess I don't think we got those trainings at school. We got training probably at practicum sites, but I could be wrong. I don't know about other schools. I can say that it doesn't mean that it was wrong, but I think that it's something of importance here for the schools to be training the students to address that with their clients. And so, what does research show when what it regards storage and access to firearms?
Yeah, sure. So one of the main points that we work in our Project Safeguard actually, is that storage of firearms. So what we call unsafe storage, which would be either loaded or unlocked somewhere, easily accessible, have the ammunition stored next to the firearm. That's what we talk about when we talk about safe storage and access. And that would be an example of unsafe storage. If that person who owns that firearm happens to get to a crisis point where they are suicidal, that access is so much more easy for them. So the idea is we reduce that access and we reduce that risk of them dying by suicide.
And should we be asking this question to every single person? Because I think most of the time people ask questions to clients who have, for instance, a military background, or if they were if they were a police officer, right, who were trained in one way to use firearms. And so, should we be asking everyone or just these people?
I think we should be asking everyone. Our clinic actually trains us so that we ask about suicide risk at every session with every client. And so, especially in that very first session when we're working with someone, we'll kind of do a full suicide risk assessment. based off of the Joyner model and the Chew model, and ask about access to lethal means, including firearms. And so I think it definitely should be something that's asked about in a variety of settings to everyone, because a lot of people own firearms. And coming from Mississippi, I definitely learned that.
Yeah, yeah. That that definitely makes a lot of sense, right? Because if what we know that like, if affect and behavior could be influent to an individual's or likelihood of actually going through with dying by suicide, then I think it is imperative to ask about these questions every single session, right? I think sometimes, and I don't want to speak for everybody, but I think sometimes we can kind of get into this habit, right, where okay, we assess for suicidal ideation, plan, intent. It doesn't seem to be there, or this individual doesn't seem like they would carry a firearm or own a firearm, and kind of write it off, right? Go to the next symptom, and regardless if that is from maybe just a lack of knowledge about suicidal behaviors and the research behind it, or just not wanting to ask those questions, I think it's definitely important to kind of work through that, right? And as you mentioned, assess each session. It really could be very valuable not only to the therapeutic relationship but also their livelihood as well.
Mhm.
And Ronnie read something about gun storage map project. Did I say that correct?
Mhm.
Okay, so tell
This
us
is
a little
definitely
bit more
this
about
is
that.
gun
Yeah,
storage.
yeah. And so it's based off of a project that was done by a coalition in Colorado. It's putting together a list of gun shops that are willing to temporarily store firearms for people who might be in like a suicidal crisis, but it could also be if they're leaving the state, or going away for a bit, or even if they're having kids over and they don't have an option for storage. Um, and the point is that because when someone's in a suicidal crisis, they might not feel comfortable asking a friend or a family member to hold on to their firearm. So this is kind of a way to mitigate that a bit and give them another option.
Yeah, I think it is a wonderful option. I haven't ran into that scenario yet, but as we were talking about this, I was just thinking like, what if they don't have anybody to, give their gun to? What
Yeah.
do they do?
Yeah,
So that just answers the question.
Yeah.
of
I don't
course.
know if that's available country nationwide. So now I want to ask my supervisor about it.
Yeah, but that's because there's so many different state laws too. So unfortunately, I don't know if it. I think it's going to have to like vary state by state depending on what they require in terms of background checks and if any state has risk requirements for it either.
Mm.
Yeah. And I think that you make a great point out, T, and I'll kind of piggyback off of that. But we are taught in school at practicums, if there is lethal means, it is your duty to kind of get that under control as soon as possible. So that means reaching out to next to kin or reaching out to whoever is at the house at the moment. But I mean, I'm sure that there's many circumstances, even though I haven't been in that uh, situation, excuse me, this situation yet. It's a hard word for me. Um, but it would complicate things quite a bit if there is nobody at home to confiscate those weapons, or not even confiscate, but safely store them. So this is a great option. That should be nationwide. Let's push for it.
Okay.
Well, hopefully.
Yeah, yeah. So since we're talking about how research informs us on how to address firearms, what are some of other things that research tells us, that clinical psychologists or mental health professionals should address during those encounters?
And what do you mean those encounters? Sorry.
So talking to a client about suicide prevention or intervention.
Yeah, and so I think one thing is to kind of normalize talking about suicide. I think people are very nervous about that, understandably so. And there's also this fear that if they disclose that they've been having suicidal thoughts, that immediately means you're going to call 911 and get them hospitalized. And so I think it's really important when you're meeting with the client, especially for the very first time, is to kind of go over what your first procedure is. And so if there's a way that, like, if they are having suicidal thoughts and they have a plan, is there a way that you can reduce that access or help keep them safe? Can they go and be with someone during that time versus like having to get them hospitalized? And that if it gets to the point where the client thinks they can't keep themselves safe, and that they do need help, try to collaboratively discuss the idea of them potentially going to the hospital versus that, kind of destigmatize it a bit and make them realize that we have a protocol. There's these different steps that have to happen before we would call 911. And again, to assess at every session, even if the person's coming in just for like an ADHD assessment, normalize that for them.
And those are great strategies and points to follow through for sure. And a lot of, I guess, major agencies or hospitals, they have a protocol in place. And so it's a matter of getting trained to follow that protocol, because you can then go to a different hospital agency and have yet a different protocol with more steps or maybe one less stuff or whatever. But if you're in a private practice, to not forget to assess for suicide, and with that, create a plan, right? And we're now in this world where we use telehealth, and the protocols are changing. I don't know if there's a lot of research on it, but I mean, I think you can still apply anyways a lot of things. Is there anything that you guys know that research has shown to be effective when it regards to doing assessment and you're not in person, not face to face?
New field of research, yeah. Is there anything?
I don't know, Kayla, if you are, but I'm not aware of anything off the top of my head in terms of like with telehealth, which I think is a good concept. I know they've been doing a lot of trainings on like how you can still use a safety plan and create that through telehealth. And there's like apps now that you can use for safety planning, which is great.
Yeah, and asking a lot of questions before and during, especially right at the beginning, because if there is any type of intervention to be done, then you're focusing that in the beginning rather than when you're running out of time.
Yes, yeah. True.
And having kind of like a safety plan already in place for yourself. So maybe if it's a new patient, you're just now seeing them, but having kind of a good idea of your own protocol in terms of how you want to assess them. And of course, at the beginning of session, obviously, I definitely agree with that. And then if that does come up, or if there is a hint of possible self-interest behaviors or suicidality, kind of being able to know mentally ahead of time, okay, well, we're going to branch off and focus directly on this, and we're going to do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah. And especially when you're doing, again, telehealth, and there are providers out there who maybe they are offering support, right, or services, and the patient is at a different location. And so becoming familiar with the services out there, because you have to know maybe 911 might not be available at a given location. Thinking about rural areas, you have to become familiar with the crisis lines around those areas, because 911 sometimes doesn't get to them.
Yeah.
I don't know if a lot of people know that.
Now they do. And I'll also add in something else that just came up is double checking on their address, right? So when doing telehealth, of course, the first couple sessions, that's something I think that is always like highly assessed, right? What's your address, what's your closest location, and I think it's imperative to, as the sessions go on, or as you start doing more and more telehealth, not becoming lax in that area, right? Because yes, you have that on file, but the session could change, right? It's telehealth for a reason. It's meant to be flexible. So if the individual is in their car, take note of that. What stops or what street signs are you by? If they're at a relative's house, definitely always asking those questions before. So if a situation does arise, everyone is on the same page and we're not scrambling for addresses, right?
Yeah. And then if research doesn't show details pertaining to telehealth yet, again, we are not 100% sure. There might be, and I apologize for not knowing 100%.
I apologize too. Yeah.
Yeah, same. Very important.
Yeah.
We can still get informed and learn from one another and develop best practice, right? And then eventually, when there's time, because no one was necessarily anticipating COVID in ways to hit us, to develop best practices that have been informed by research. And especially again, if you're in a private practice setting, it's much harder to come up with that. So I think there's a lot of teamwork, even if you don't really have a team, but more like colleague work, I guess. Because when you are again like working for somebody else, at an agency, then the ethics committee plus a bunch of other people will come up with a protocol. We talked about, I guess, 911 and whatnot. So in a way to provide support to the patient or the client receiving our services. But let's say the client or the patient, they want to call and get in touch with somebody, right? So that would be a hotline or a crisis line. So what can they expect, I guess?
Yeah, sure. So as Ronnie mentioned, I have served as a volunteer crisis hotline counselor for the Lifeline, which is the main suicide hotline that you see around. It's the main national number. So just to give kind of an idea of what happens when they call, someone will answer the phone, a trained crisis worker will answer the phone, and first they're going to build a relationship with them. Research has shown that building rapport with the caller is going to make that any kind of crisis mitigation or just talking through feelings a lot more effective. And then they will ask the question outright, are you thinking of killing yourself? Which is really important, just asking the question. There's a myth that says that actually makes them think about it more and that it increases the risk, but research has shown that it doesn't, and it's actually a very effective way of getting that to that. So that's what's going to happen first. And then it's just a conversation very focused on the caller or client that you prefer. Just talking about why they're having these feelings, just assessing their lethality and calling support if necessary. But it's just a very open conversation, very non-judgmental, and it's just discussing choices and alternatives to them killing themselves. So that was kind of a long answer.
No, it was not. Thank you for your work, for volunteer work.
Oh, no problem.
Yeah, and I'll just ask a follow-up question to that. So what is if you could give us and our listeners just a little taste of the training leading up to that, because of course that is important work. It's much needed. Hotlines, I can imagine how many lives that they have saved over the years. So just out of curiosity, what was kind of the work or training needed for that?
Yeah, sure. So I personally went through a couple of months of training, which was very role play heavy. I'm sure that Sam's probably experienced that too, being in a clinic, and you guys as well. A lot of it is just role playing a bunch of different scenarios. And the particular hotline that I was trained on wasn't just suicide, but for suicide focused ones, that was the heaviest training. And also just learning the research behind why people die by suicide, the different models there, like Sam mentioned, Joiner's model, and everything that we were taught was research backed, and there were sources in our handbooks, and I think that's really important as well. And it's just learning about suicide and why it happens, who it happens to, and what you can do in that situation.
Yeah, thank you. I love that, because I think it's one thing to know how to function in a certain situation, but another reason to know why you're functioning in that certain situation, and the research behind it, and having all of that academic knowledge really prior to going into that training, I think is very helpful in terms of the outlook of things. So yeah, that's awesome.
And to circle back in the whole telehealth thing, I guess we didn't think about the offer that the hotlines right, did the job that you guys do. So I'm sure the protocol can really inform us, providing telehealth work. So should a person be does the person have to be in crisis to call a crisis line?
Not necessarily. All of the crisis workers that you call are trained in just general counseling as well. So just using what we call feeling reflections, active listening, just talking through any kind of situation really that you might be going through. It's free to call for anybody 24/7. Yeah, you don't necessarily have to be in a suicidal crisis to call the hotline at all.
Yeah, and we will be sharing the numbers in our pages. It's also on our website as well as the Instagram page, so that if you want to share with other professionals or clients or whoever you want to share that with, that information is going to be available to you guys too. And I know that some people are outside of the country, and so we have made an effort and attempted to actually include some hotlines from different countries. If you know of a line that we can add to our list of resources, please share with us too, because we're gonna continue to improve that for sure. We want to make sure that we include everyone. And I know too that the U.S. is very diverse, right? I speak a different language. So let's say if I wasn't fluent in English or had difficulties expressing my feelings in English, would I be able to communicate with somebody, in a crisis line?
Yeah, to my knowledge, at least the center that I worked at, we had translators that were Spanish speaking and also Haitian Creole as well. And we also were able to call a translating line in case we needed a transfer. So if anybody was calling and needed pretty much at least any language that I know of, we would be able to dial a translator in, even for ASL as well, sign language too. And we also, so we would just be able to dial a translator in to be on that call. So try to make it accessible that way.
Yeah, I guess I never really thought about it, how because we're often promoting like we communicating in English. We do have hotline numbers for Spanish speakers and people from outside of the country that speak different languages anyways, but I wasn't sure if there'll be translators available and ready to go.
That's good. And also I'll ask, of course, the hotline has a target audience, right? But if there's an individual calling in, maybe they suspect a family member or a close one, right, that is going through a difficult time, are you allowed to take those calls? Do you call
Yeah.
for second parties?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that is what we call second party calls. And basically what we did in that situation is to just talk to the person, build a relationship like any other caller, and we would go through with them the steps that we use. So I should have mentioned this in the training piece. There was actually a very specific, like, multiple step plan, like a flow chart, if you will, of like what to do in situations, which we always had in front of us and needed to memorize for our like training exams and everything. So we have that we would provide to second party callers to give them an idea of what they can do and empower them to take the steps that we would. And we also would always encourage that person to put the crisis person on the phone if available, if they were willing as well. But it just goes to show that there are things that we can do in our daily lives. You don't have to be a hotline counselor. You don't have to be trained. And we would just try to give them the tools to do that.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, I think it's now it's a good time to talk about help-seeking behavior as well as what research tells us pertaining to people that or I guess who is more likely, or I don't even want to say necessarily who is more likely, but I guess one way that it has been affected the most, or help me here, what does research show? And then like, please call me out because I don't want to say something that is incorrect and also doesn't reflect something that's constructive.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think for help seeking, there's many people don't really like to seek help for suicidal thoughts because there is this stigma with it. And people also have this fear of maybe being hospitalized and kind of losing that autonomy and freedom in a way. And so there's why it's helpful to kind of think about these different ways of how can we target the people who might be suicidal and in a crisis but aren't going to be willing to seek help, even though we have like help seeking campaigns and different options available for that. And that's kind of really where we think the reducing access to legal means can be really helpful as like a primary prevention tool.
Okay. So we're talking about the different people then that have suffered stigma here. So what does research show about experiencing maybe bullying, adversity, and adverse experiences, and suicide?
Was that?
Yeah, no, I'll go ahead and take that. Yeah, so I have been getting involved in research with the transgender community. That's an interest that I have personally, and I'm sure that it's not just in transgender communities, just in bullying in general. Kids age K through 12 that experience, we see the research shows much higher attempt rate. Just having that experience either later on in life, having that experience as a child and later on in life, or as a child themselves. Just the experience of stigmatizing and victimization can be really detrimental and lead to suicidal capability. Yeah.
Go ahead, Ronnie.
Yeah, no, I was just going to transition. So, I mean, you brought up the transgender community, and I think it's a great time to provide a little bit more information, right? And it's something that I think maybe isn't talked about as much. You know, I think that suicide as a topic isn't talked about enough, and that is obviously the umbrella word under suicide, suicidal thoughts or behaviors due to or secondary to bullying or secondary to abuse, right? Things like that. So I think transgender, it fills a large portion of those statistics. And I don't have any off the top of my head, and I'm sure that we'll get to some here in a bit, but there is a very high correlation between transgender individuals and suicidality. That's correct, right?
Yeah, that is correct. And based on it's called the U.S. Transgender Survey. It was conducted by the National Center for Transgender Equality back in 2015. Just higher attempt rates, like across the board, just higher ideation and attempt compared to the U.S. population. Sorry, I didn't mean to transition prematurely there. It's just
No.
But yeah. So it's just across the board, much higher risk for suicidal thoughts and behaviors when compared to the rest of the U.S. population. Yeah.
Which again, like I know we were talking about pay attention to depression, pay attention to other like substance use and whatnot, right? Now we're talking about other variables, and I don't like to say necessarily variables, but thinking about research, we look at variables, right? And then thinking about how the society sees you and how society sees themselves, well, the individuals in society sees themselves, right? And how that type of relationship and perception plays a role in our mental health. And unfortunately, because of many things, because of many other variables, we have that. And I think that having this type of conversation, it might not be a lot, but I think it is a small steps towards making change and raising awareness. Because again, we are trying to talk about suicide prevention as suicide is preventable. The message that we're trying to share is that suicide is preventable. And if you're from a transgender community or not, and we are here, to spread that message. But nevertheless, the rates are so alarming that I think it's important for us to pay attention, not only what happens within the community, and also what happens outside of that community that is affecting that community so negatively.
Yeah, and using research studies like this or surveys like this and other ones that, if I may borrow your word, variables that look at specific variables or confounding variables, and then using that to prepare you for a certain patient or a certain session, right? Understanding that maybe rates are higher, right? And it's not generalizing, it's just preparing for the possibility of something being present, right? And I think that is the duty of a mental health professional, just in general, right? If we know that there are higher rates in certain populations, it is our due diligence, I love that words, to assess more, or to assess the possibility of suicide. this case, right?
Yeah. And with that, what are then some variables or risk factors associated or contributing to like this high incidence, right, of suicide thoughts and behaviors within the transgender community?
Well, one thing is just identifying as being in a marginalized group, which can also relate to other marginalized groups, not just transgender folks, but just higher stress overall, including what I mentioned before, just higher rates of victimization. Research has shown much higher rates of both sexual assault and physical attack, which can be extremely damaging and again increase what we call capability for suicide as a traumatic experience. Um, yeah, and also just painful experiences like that, and also another big one that I've seen in the research is family rejection. That's another big one within the just LGBTQ community in general, is family rejection that actually can is correlated to higher attempt rate if your family has rejected you or if you've been kicked out of your house for any reason. That's also a risk factor as well.
Yeah. And it's important to be aware of those factors. Doesn't mean that those factors will be present in every single situation. I think it does inform us that we become more sensitive and pay attention, and we definitely address when conducting an interview or during treatment in ways so that again we are trying to prevent suicide, right?
And gathering that whole picture, because Kayla, you mentioned not only one, two, three. I mean, there's multiple different risk factors there, right? And it may not be just from two or three in their past or present. It's our duty again to really assess them biopsychosocially, right? And understand how all of these things intervene and can interact to lead to the current presentation if it is suicidality. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And also just recognizing not to treat any population, a special population like transgender folks, as a monolith either, as one population where everything is true for it. There's differences within those populations too. And that's also very important to be aware of when assessing
Yeah.
the risk.
Well, thank you for that. I know we're getting close to the end here. This has been very informative. And I wanted to ask you guys if there's anything else that you want to add that maybe you haven't had a chance to address today. You good? That's okay.
It was a really good conversation.
Yeah, we covered a lot. We covered a lot.
Yeah, we covered a lot today, and we're very thankful, grateful that we had this opportunity to not only Psyconnect with you all, but also to learn from you guys, from your work. And we're grateful that you guys are out there in a research-led community trying to learn more and spread the word.
Thank you. And
Yeah, thank you so much.
this is a great opportunity too. I think what you're all doing is really awesome about really getting the word out there and connecting with others. And I like it a lot.
Thank you. It's all about staying connected in psychology.
Making research accessible, super important.
Yeah.
Yeah. We really try to make it easier for people to understand because we know there's a stigma associated with research. Ronnie, if you want to add a few more words.
Of course. So I'll second a couple of things that you said, and also making it accessible is really one of our main goals and driving factors. And what better way than to bring the sources in? So thank you very much for coming on today, and continue doing great work. This research can be so informative for student clinicians, higher level clinicians, academically. So good work. Good job.
Yeah.
Keep it up. And I'll also say that let's just try to keep up this conversation of the word suicide. I think that again, we talked about stigma at the beginning of the pod and now, and how that word is somehow kind of it brings about certain reactions that people don't feel comfortable with, right? Which makes sense. But at the same time, the way to break down some of those barriers and to make this word more normalized, as you mentioned, Kayla, is by having a conversation and really treating it like any other mental health diagnosis, condition, presentation, right? The same way that we talk about others, we do need to talk about suicide as well. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
How can our listeners, followers, right, the audience, reach out to you?
Yeah, so we are on Twitter. And so my handle, I'm sad that I don't remember it off the top of my head. I think it's @Starualo1, very unique. And Kayla's.
Yeah, I'm just at Kayla Wagler, again, very creative.
And then our lab mate, who I think you'll be having on in later in the fall, she's created an Instagram account called Science Simplified. And so that is also a cool way that we've been trying to also kind of disseminate our research and make it really digestible and get the word out. And so that's another way that you can connect with us.
Awesome. We'll definitely add that those handles in our episode description so people can just click, or if not, they try to locate it anyways, so they can stay connected with you guys. And we'll be happy to have you guys back, talk some more about suicide prevention strategies and what research tells us. We're looking forward to having your colleagues soon to talk more about this during our part 2 of this episode as part of our suicide prevention series. And if you guys want to stay Psyconnect with us in between episodes, we are on Instagram as well as YouTube. Let's Psyconnect, all one word, lowercase. Our website is letspsyconnect.com. And if you guys want to reach out to us via email, it is discussion@letspsyconnect.com. And remember, let's Psyconnect.